Have you ever wondered what it takes for a human being to reach that point where fear simply dissolves? That moment when survival stops being the priority and something far more dangerous takes its place. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that the history books tried to bury. A story about a woman whose name was whispered across plantations from Montego Bay to Kingston. A woman who orchestrated what colonial authorities called the most coordinated insurrection in Jamaican history, and then, as if she were made of smoke and vengeance, simply disappeared. The British Empire deployed over 2,000 soldiers to find her. They tortured hundreds seeking information about her whereabouts. They offered rewards that could have purchased freedom for an entire village. And yet, nobody talked. Nobody betrayed her, because what she represented had become bigger than any single person. If you've ever felt the weight of injustice pressing down on your chest, if you've ever wondered what you would do if everything was taken from you, this story will grip your soul and never let go. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal contains details that have never been told in this way. Documents that were hidden for over 2 centuries. Testimonies that the colonial powers desperately tried to erase from existence. Stay with me until the very end, because the final revelation about what truly happened to her will change everything you thought you knew about resistance, about courage, and about the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to be property. The ruins still stand in the hills above Trelawney Parish, though few tourists ever find them. Crumbling stone walls swallowed by strangler figs. The skeleton of what was once the great house of Prosperity Estate, where 847 enslaved Africans labored under conditions that would make the most hardened soul weep. The iron hooks where the punishment chains once hung have rusted to thin orange whispers, but they remain embedded in the mahogany posts of the punishment square. Local children refuse to play near these grounds after sunset. Fishermen sailing past Point Lucia still claim they hear drums on certain moonless nights, rhythms that belong to no European tradition, rhythms that once served as coded messages traveling faster than any horseback rider through the network of plantations that stretched across the northern coast. In December of 1791, this place witnessed something that colonial administrators would spend the next century trying to explain away, minimize, and ultimately forget. A woman whom the enslaved called Nanny of the Fire, whose given name was Abina, whose African name before the ships and the chains and the horror was Nana Abarewa, meaning grandmother wisdom, though she was only 32 years old, stood at the center of a conspiracy so meticulously planned that it would inspire revolts across 3 Caribbean islands and fundamentally alter how the British conceived of their human property. She was not simply brave. Bravery implies the presence of fear overcome. What Abina possessed was something far more terrifying to those who claimed ownership over her flesh. She possessed absolute clarity. The clarity of someone who has already died inside and therefore has nothing left to lose except the chance to make her death mean something beyond her own body. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you never miss an investigation. Prosperity Estate sprawled across 2,400 acres of the most fertile sugar-producing land in the Western Hemisphere. The Great House, a 2-story Georgian structure with jalousie windows designed to capture the mountain breezes, sat upon a hill overlooking the cane fields that stretched to the Caribbean horizon like a green ocean frozen in mid-wave. 37 buildings comprised the plantation complex, the boiling house where raw cane became crystalline profit, the curing house where hogsheads of sugar awaited the merchant ships, the distillery where molasses transformed into rum that made fortunes for Liverpool investors who never set foot on Jamaican soil, the trash house, the carpenter's shop, the blacksmith's forge, the hospital that was more morgue than place of healing, and the rows of slave quarters built from wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that leaked during the October rains. The owner, Cornelius Blackwood III, had never actually visited the property he had inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father who had purchased the land grant from the Crown in 1723. Blackwood lived in Bristol, England, where he served as a member of Parliament and gave rousing speeches about the civilizing mission of the British Empire, while his attorneys, his overseers, and his drivers extracted labor and life from 847 human beings, whose names he could not have pronounced if his political career depended upon it. The true master of Prosperity Estate was the head overseer, a Scotsman named Angus McCreary, who had arrived in Jamaica 23 years earlier as an indentured servant, had survived his term of bondage and had clawed his way up to his current position through a combination of brutality, cunning, and a complete absence of what most would recognize as human conscience. McCreary stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with arms like sugarcane stalks and eyes the color of the sea during a hurricane. He kept 3 whips, one of standard leather for everyday corrections, one braided with wire for serious offenses, and one soaked in brine and left to dry in the sun until it became hard as ironwood, which he reserved for examples. He called this third whip the preacher because, as he liked to say while using it, it delivers sermons that last a lifetime. Beneath McCreary served 4 white bookkeepers who managed the accounts and supervised specific operations, 12 colored drivers who enforced labor quotas among the field gangs, and who occupied that terrible middle ground between the enslaved and the enslavers, and the unnamed mass of black bodies who rose before sunrise and collapsed after sunset, who planted and cut and processed the cane that sweetened the tea of British aristocrats, who watched their children sold away to settle gambling debts, who buried their elderly in unmarked graves on the hill behind the provision grounds, who prayed to gods their captors could not name, and who, on a night that would live forever in the terrified memory of the planter class, decided together that enough was enough. The bell that marked the work hours rang at 4:30 every morning, a sound that one former slave would later describe as the voice of death calling us to another day of dying slowly. The first gang, comprised of the strongest men and women between the ages of 15 and 45, would already be in the fields by the time the tropical sun crested the Blue Mountains to the east. They worked in rows, cutting cane with machetes that were counted out each morning and counted back each evening, because a machete was also a weapon, and the overseers never forgot that they were outnumbered 15-1. The second gang, the young and the elderly, performed lighter but no less exhausting tasks: weeding, carrying water, gathering the cut cane into bundles for transport to the mill. The third gang, children as young as 4 and 5, picked grass from between the cane rows and learned from earliest memory that their bodies belonged to someone else. The hospital, such as it was, stood near the provision grounds where the enslaved were allocated small plots to grow their own food, since the estate provided only minimal rations. Dr. Ezekiel Porter, a failed physician from Edinburgh who had come to Jamaica after scandals in Scotland made practice there impossible, visited twice weekly and prescribed the same treatment for every ailment: rest and rum, knowing that neither would be provided in sufficient quantity, knowing that his role was not to heal, but to assess which bodies could still produce labor and which had become worthless. When someone died, their body would be carried to the burial ground by family members who were given exactly 2 hours to perform whatever funeral rites they could manage before being required to return to the fields. No grave markers were permitted. No names were recorded. The dead became as anonymous as they had been in life, known only to those who had loved them and who carried their memories like hidden treasure. Abena occupied a unique position within this hierarchy of suffering. She had been born on the estate 32 years before the night that would change everything, the daughter of an Akan woman named Afua, who served as the cook in the great house, and a father she never knew, sold away before her first memory. Her mother had taught her to read and write in secret, using discarded newspapers that wrapped supplies from Kingston, scratching letters in the dirt behind the cookhouse, risking the punishment of death that accompanied literacy among the enslaved, because Afua believed that words were weapons and her daughter would need every weapon available. By the age of 12, Abena had been apprenticed to the plantation's healer, an old woman called Mama Sese, who knew the medicinal properties of every plant in the Jamaican hills, who could reduce a fever with bush tea, set a broken bone with bamboo splints, ease the passage of a difficult birth, and, when necessary, hasten the death of those who could no longer bear their suffering. Mama Sese taught Abena something even more valuable than medicine. She taught her the geography of the estate that the overseers never saw, the hidden paths through the provision grounds, the caves in the limestone hills where Maroons had sheltered during the wars of the previous century, the network of information that flowed between plantations through the women who sold produce at Sunday markets, the men who were hired out to neighboring estates for specialized labor, the sailors who worked the coastal trade and carried news from Kingston to Montego Bay to Lucia and back again. Abena moved between worlds with an ease that made her invaluable and invisible in equal measure. She treated the fevers and wounds of the enslaved in their quarters, but she also attended to the Blackwood family during their rare visits, to the overseers' households when their wives or children fell ill, even to McCreary himself when a tropical ulcer on his leg threatened to send him to an early grave. She knew which overseer beat his wife after drinking too much rum on Saturday nights. She knew which driver was stealing from the estate stores. She knew that McCreary kept a locked chest beneath his bed containing 340 pounds sterling in gold coins and the only copy of the estate's slave registry. She knew that the powder magazine behind the distillery contained 40 muskets, 200 pounds of gunpowder, and enough shot to fight a small war. She knew these things because people spoke freely in front of someone they had trained themselves not to see as fully human. To the white inhabitants of Prosperity Estate, Abina was a useful tool, like a well-made hoe or a sturdy cart, something that performed its function without requiring acknowledgement of its interior life. This was their fundamental error. This was what would destroy them. Leave a comment below saying never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The year 1791 had already brought horrors that exceeded even the brutal normal of plantation life. In March, McCreary had instituted what he called the new efficiency measures, which meant reducing the rest period during the harvest from 15 minutes every 4 hours to 10 minutes every 5 hours. 3 field workers died in the following month from heat exhaustion and overwork. Their deaths were recorded in the estate books as losses of property, valued at 85 pounds each, the same price as a good breeding mule. In May, a woman named Grace, who had served in the Great House for 11 years and was known for her gentle temperament and beautiful singing voice, was accused of stealing a silver spoon that a visiting merchant had actually pocketed. McCreary did not investigate. McCreary did not ask questions. McCreary stripped Grace naked in the punishment square at noon when the sun was at its most merciless, tied her to the post that still stands in those ruins, and applied the preacher until the flesh of her back hung in ribbons and her screams had become whimpers, and her whimpers had become silence. She died 3 days later in the hospital, never having regained consciousness, never having had the chance to say goodbye to her 2 children who were sold the following week to separate buyers in Spanish Town. Abina had treated Grace's wounds. Abina had held her hand as the infection spread and the fever took hold. Abina had closed Grace's eyes when the breathing finally stopped. In June, a group of 8 men attempted to escape to the maroon settlements in the Cockpit country. They were captured within 4 days, betrayed by a slave from a neighboring estate who had been promised his freedom in exchange for information. McCreary made a spectacle of their punishment. The leader, a young man named Cudjoe who was known for his skill with horses, was burned alive in front of the assembled population of the estate, over 800 people forced to watch as the flames consumed a man whose only crime was the desire to be free. The other 7 were hanged from the great cotton tree near the entrance to the estate, their bodies left to rot for a week as a warning, as a lesson, as a reminder of who held power and who held nothing. Abena watched Cudjoe burn. She watched the flames rise and heard his screams mingle with the crackling of the wood and the sobs of his mother, who had to be restrained by 3 drivers to prevent her from throwing herself into the fire after her son. Something shifted in Abena that day. Something that had been building for years, something that Mama Sese had perhaps seen coming when she first took the girl under her wing. The part of Abena that had survived by accepting, by adapting, by making herself useful to her oppressors, that part died in the smoke that rose from Cudjoe's body. What remained was harder, colder, more dangerous. What remained was a woman who no longer asked whether resistance was possible, but only how to make it as devastating as possible. The transformation in Abena was not a single moment, but a process that accelerated after Cudjoe's death. She began to observe with new eyes, cataloging weaknesses, noting schedules, testing loyalties. The network of information that Mama Ses had shown her became something more than a means of survival. It became the nervous system of a conspiracy. Abena understood something that many who attempted revolt had failed to grasp. The system was not maintained by the whips and the chains alone. The system was maintained by isolation, by the careful separation of people who might otherwise recognize their common cause, by the cultivation of distrust between house slaves and field slaves, between Africans of different ethnic groups, between the enslaved and the small population of free coloreds who occupied an ambiguous position in the colonial hierarchy. To overthrow the system, she would need to build something that the system had worked for centuries to prevent. She would need to build unity. The process began with conversations that seemed innocent, treatments that lasted longer than necessary, visits to the sick that became opportunities to share information and test responses. Abina discovered allies in unexpected places. Thomas, the head driver who was despised by the enslaved population for his role in enforcing discipline, but who had watched his sister sold away 5 years earlier and had been waiting ever since for an opportunity to make someone pay. Patience, the cook who had replaced Abina's mother after Afua's death, and who had access to every meal served in the great house. Samuel, a skilled blacksmith, who was hired out to neighboring estates and could move between plantations without raising suspicion. Mary, an elderly woman who led the prayer meetings on Sunday evenings, and whose voice carried an authority that even McCreary was reluctant to challenge. Jupiter, a boatman who transported goods along the coast, and who knew the schedules of the British patrol vessels that guarded against exactly the kind of coordination Abina was planning. The inner circle numbered 12 by the end of August. Each member knew the others. Each had been tested through small acts of defiance and mutual protection. Each had something in their past that made the risk of revolt preferable to the certainty of continued enslavement. But 12 people could not overthrow an estate of over 800. For that, Abina needed something more. She needed a moment that would transform individual grievances into collective rage. That moment came on September 14th, 1791. Abina's younger sister, Mercy, was 17 years old. She worked in the second gang, carrying water to the cane cutters, and was known for her shy smile and the way she sang while she worked, songs in the Akan language that their mother had taught them both before the fever took Efua 4 years earlier. Mercy was beautiful in a way that attracted attention, the kind of attention that no enslaved woman wanted, the kind of attention that could not be refused without consequences. The bookkeeper in charge of the second gang was a man named William Croft, the youngest son of a minor English family who had come to Jamaica to make his fortune and had discovered that the colonies offered opportunities for indulgence that would never be tolerated at home. Croft had noticed Mercy. Croft had made his intentions clear. Mercy had done what she could to avoid him, working in groups, never being alone, seeking the protection of older women who understood the danger. On September 14th, Croft found her alone in the provision grounds where she had gone to harvest yams for the evening meal. What happened there was not recorded in any official document. But Abena found her sister afterward, found her sitting in the dirt with her dress torn and her eyes empty and blood on her thighs. And in that moment, whatever restraint Abena had maintained, whatever calculation had tempered her rage, whatever fear had counseled patience, all of it burned away like morning mist in the Caribbean sun. Mercy never spoke again. Not a word, not a sound. She retreated to some place inside herself where the horror could not reach her, and she never returned. She continued to work, to eat, to sleep. But the person who had sung Akan songs while carrying water to the cane cutters was gone, replaced by a hollow vessel that moved through the world without leaving any trace of the spirit that had once inhabited it. Abena washed her sister's wounds. Abena helped her back to their quarters. Abena held her through the night while Mercy stared at the thatched ceiling without blinking, without crying, without any sign that she registered her sister's presence. And when the morning bell rang at 4:30, Abena made a promise that she sealed with the blood she drew from her own palm using Mama Sess's surgical knife. She promised that Croft would die. She promised that McCreary would die. She promised that the great House of Prosperity estate would burn to ash that would blow out across the Caribbean Sea. She promised that before the year ended, the enslaved of this place would either be free or would die fighting for that freedom. There would be no more waiting. There would be no more patience. There would only be fire and blood, and the terrible justice that the legal system would never provide. McCreary sensed something changing in the weeks that followed, though he could not have named it or traced its source. He noticed that conversation stopped when he approached. He noticed that work continued at exactly the pace required, no faster and no slower, as if some collective decision had been made to give him nothing to punish and nothing to praise. He noticed that the Sunday prayer meetings had grown longer, more fervent, with songs that seemed to carry meanings he could not decipher. He increased patrols. He conducted surprise inspections of the slave quarters. He had the drivers report any unusual gatherings, any whispered conversations, any signs of communication with neighboring estates. He found nothing. The conspiracy was too careful, too dispersed, too well organized to leave traces that his methods could detect. Abina had learned from the failures of previous revolts. She knew that the 1760 Takis rebellion had been betrayed by an informant within the inner circle. She knew that the 1776 Hanover plot had collapsed when conspirators had been overheard discussing their plans. She knew that the British had developed sophisticated methods for extracting information from captured rebels, methods that would break even the strongest will. So she built something different. She built a network where no single person knew the full extent of the plan, where information flowed in fragments that only made sense when assembled, where the final details would not be revealed until the last possible moment. McCreary was not the only antagonist whose cruelties fed the flames that Abina was gathering. William Croft, the bookkeeper who had destroyed Mercy, was a man whose appetites extended beyond sexual violence. He kept a ledger of his own, separate from the estate accounts, in which he recorded debts owed to him by enslaved people who had traded future favors for small mercies, an extra food ration during illness, permission to visit family on a neighboring estate, protection from punishment for minor infractions. The currency of these debts was always flesh. The women who could not pay would be forced to provide what Croft considered compensation. The men who could not pay would watch their wives or daughters become Croft's victims. This system had operated for 6 years, creating a web of shame and silence that bound its victims to their abuser through their own complicity in his crimes. Dr. Ezekiel Porter, the estate physician, conducted experiments on patients who were too ill to resist or too frightened to refuse. He tested the effects of various doses of laudanum, seeking to determine exactly how much could be administered before death occurred. He amputated limbs unnecessarily to practice his surgical technique. He collected samples of tissue and bone that he sent to colleagues in Edinburgh, who were developing theories about racial difference, theories that required physical evidence of the inferiority they had already assumed. The colored driver named Frederick, who had risen to his position through betraying an escape plot 3 years earlier, used his authority to settle personal scores, to demand payments and favors, to build a small empire of intimidation that mirrored in miniature the larger system he served. And overshadowing them all was Cornelius Blackwood himself, thousands of miles away in Bristol, who had never seen the suffering his wealth required, who had never smelled the blood in the punishment square, or heard the screams from the boiling house when a worker slipped and fell into the vats of molten sugar, who recorded the annual profits in his account books and complained at dinner parties about the ingratitude of the enslaved and the necessity of firm discipline in managing tropical properties. October 1791 arrived with the hurricane season winding down and the harvest beginning in earnest. This was the most brutal time of year, when the cane had to be cut and processed quickly before the sugar content declined, when the workdays stretched from before dawn until after midnight, when the boiling house fires never went cold and the exhaustion became a physical presence that pressed down on every worker like an invisible weight. It was also the time when the overseers were most stretched, when attention was focused on production quotas and shipping schedules, when the gaps in surveillance that Abina had been studying became wide enough to exploit. The date she chose was December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. It was also the night when the Blackwood family held their annual Christmas celebration, when neighboring planters and their families gathered at Prosperity Estate for a ball that lasted until dawn, when rum flowed freely, and the vigilance of the white population would be at its lowest ebb. McCreary would be occupied serving as host in Blackwood's absence. The bookkeepers would be drunk. The militia members who lived on neighboring estates would all be at the party. The patrol schedules would be disrupted by the celebration. For one night, the machinery of surveillance and control that normally operated with relentless efficiency would be distracted, divided, vulnerable. Abina presented the plan to her inner circle on November 15th, in the cave hidden behind the waterfall in the hills above the provision grounds. Thomas would lead the first strike against the overseers' houses where the weapons were stored. Samuel the blacksmith had spent months secretly forging machetes and pikes that were hidden in the caves, but they would need the muskets to have any chance against the inevitable military response. Patience would ensure that the food and drink served at the Christmas ball was laced with a preparation that Abina had created from Mama Sesse's recipes. Not enough to kill, but enough to slow reactions and cloud judgment. Jupiter had made contact with enslaved populations on 12 neighboring estates, spreading word that December 21st would be the night, that when they saw fire rising from Prosperity Estate, they should rise as well. The rebellion would not be isolated. It would be coordinated. It would be the largest slave uprising in Jamaican history. The plan had phases. The first phase would neutralize the immediate threats: the overseers, the drivers who could not be trusted, the weapons stores. The second phase would secure the estate, freeing those who wished to join and protecting those who did not wish to fight. The third phase would coordinate with the other estates, creating a front of rebellion that stretched from Montego Bay to Falmouth. The fourth phase, if all went well, would open negotiations with the colonial government from a position of strength, demanding freedom and land, and the right to live as human beings rather than property. Abina knew the fourth phase was probably a fantasy. She knew the British would never negotiate with rebellious slaves. She knew that the most likely outcome was death for everyone involved. But she also knew that death was coming regardless, that the average enslaved person on a Jamaican sugar plantation lived only 7 to 10 years after arrival, that the system consumed bodies at a rate that required constant importation from Africa to maintain the labor force, that the choice was not between life and death but between dying as property and dying as people who had fought for their freedom. The choice, put that way, was no choice at all. The weeks between November 15th and December 21st passed with agonizing slowness. Every day brought new risks of discovery. A careless word, a suspicious glance, a conspiracy unraveled by coincidence or betrayal could destroy everything in an instant. Abina continued her rounds, treating the sick, attending to the overseers' families, moving through the estate as she had always moved, invisible in plain sight. But now every interaction was an intelligence-gathering mission. Every conversation was an opportunity to refine the plan. Every night she lay awake in her quarters next to her silent sister, reviewing details, anticipating problems, preparing for contingencies. McCreary noticed that Abina was spending more time in the hospital, more time visiting the quarters of the second and third gangs, more time walking the paths between the cane fields. He mentioned this to Dr. Porter during one of the physician's twice-weekly visits. Porter dismissed the concern. "She's a healer," he said. "They develop attachments to their patients. It's almost admirable in a primitive sort of way." McCreary was not satisfied, but he had more pressing concerns. The harvest was behind schedule. Blackwood's agents in Kingston were demanding increased shipments. 2 of the bookkeepers had fallen ill with fever, reducing the supervisory capacity. A shipment of new slaves from Africa had arrived with a sickness that required quarantine, preventing them from being integrated into the workforce. The Christmas ball required preparations that consumed time and attention. The conspiracy grew beneath his notice, like roots spreading underground, invisible until the moment they burst through the surface and revealed themselves as an entirely new landscape. The other estates were preparing as well. On Harmony Plantation, 10 miles to the east, a man named Caesar had organized a corps of 30 fighters who had been drilling at night in the cane fields, using sticks as stand-ins for the weapons they would seize when the moment came. At Golden Vale, a woman named Cuba, who had been a queen in her African homeland before her capture, had united the Akan speakers on the estate with a ritual that bound them to the cause through blood and oath. At Retreat, Blue Mountain, Flamstead, and 8 other plantations stretching across Trelawney and St. James parishes, similar preparations were underway, each group knowing only that they were part of something larger, that the fire at Prosperity Estate would be their signal, that after that night, nothing would ever be the same. December 18th arrived with news that almost destroyed the plan. Jupiter returned from a coastal run with word that a British naval vessel had arrived in Montego Bay, carrying 100 additional troops, sent to reinforce the garrison in response to rumors of unrest that had reached Kingston. The colonial authorities knew something was coming. They did not know what or when or where, but they had received enough fragmentary intelligence to take precautions. Abena convened an emergency meeting of the inner circle in the cave. Some counseled delay. Others argued that delay would only give the authorities more time to discover the conspiracy. Abena listened to every voice, weighed every argument, and made her decision. They would proceed as planned. The troops in Montego Bay could not reach Prosperity Estate in time to prevent the initial rising. The coordination with the other estates meant that the military would face simultaneous uprisings across a 60-mile front, far too wide to suppress immediately. And perhaps most importantly, the enslaved populations of the other estates were already committed. To delay would be to abandon allies who had trusted them. To delay would be to prove that their oppressors were right, that the enslaved lacked the courage and the discipline to fight for their freedom. The plan would proceed. December 21st would be the night. The morning of December 21st, 1791, dawned with unusual clouds gathering over the mountains, dark and heavy with rain that would come and go throughout the day. The estate was in frantic preparation for the evening's ball. House slaves were cleaning every surface, polishing silver that would be used for the feast, arranging flowers that had been brought in from Montego Bay, preparing the ballroom with candles that would number in the hundreds by the time the guests arrived. The field gangs continued their work in the cane, the cutting and loading and transporting that could not pause even for the Christmas celebration. But there was a different quality to their labor that day, an intensity that the drivers attributed to the promise of extra rum rations that had been announced for the holiday, but that had an entirely different source. Abina made her rounds as she always did, but today she carried more than her medicine bag. Hidden in the false bottom of her basket were the final instructions, written on scraps of paper that would be burned immediately after reading, confirming the timeline, the signals, the responsibilities of each group. Thomas would strike the overseer houses at the 3rd hour after midnight, when the celebration would be at its peak, and the guests at their drunkest. Samuel's forged weapons had been distributed to fighters across the estate, hidden in places that would allow quick retrieval. Patience had prepared the drugged wine and rum that would slow the white response. Mary had informed the other elders, who would protect the children and the elderly during the fighting. Jupiter had made the final coastal run, confirming that the other estates were ready and waiting for the signal fire. As the sun set and the guests began arriving in their carriages, as the light from hundreds of candles spilled from the windows of the great house across the carefully manicured gardens, as the sound of European music and white laughter drifted down to the slave quarters where 847 people made their final preparations in silence, Abena stood in the doorway of the hospital and looked up at the darkening sky. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to read in defiance of laws that prescribed death for enslaved literacy. She thought of Mama Cess, who had shown her that knowledge was power, and that power could be used for purposes the oppressors never imagined. She thought of Grace, whose wrongful death had been one of so many that the white population stopped counting. She thought of Cudjoe, whose screams as the flames consumed him still echoed in her memory. She thought of Mercy, who sat silent and empty in their quarters, waiting for a reckoning that might or might not bring her back from wherever she had gone. And she thought of the generations yet unborn, the children of the children who might survive this night, who might one day live in a world where their bodies belonged to themselves, where their labor served their own purposes, where they could walk in the sunlight without fear. For them, she was willing to die. For them, she was willing to do things that would haunt whatever afterlife awaited her. For them, she lit the first signal fire in the hills above the estate and watched it rise into the darkness like a prayer made of smoke and flame. The 3rd hour after midnight arrived with the Christmas ball still in full swing. McCreary had outdone himself as host. The guests had consumed the drugged refreshments with enthusiasm, and the sounds of increasingly sloppy dancing and off-key singing filled the great house. In the overseer houses that formed a ring around the plantation complex, the white staff who were not attending the ball had fallen asleep, lulled by the seasonal celebration and their own exhaustion. The night patrol had been reduced for the holiday, only 2 drivers walking the perimeter when there would normally be 6, and those 2 had been selected by Thomas for their known sympathies. At precisely 3:15, Thomas led a group of 20 men from the shadows where they had gathered. They moved in silence, barefoot, carrying the machetes that Samuel had forged in his shop, while the overseers watched him make horseshoes and barrel hoops. The first overseer house held the assistant head overseer, a man named Crawford, who was known for his fondness for burning slaves who did not meet their quotas. He died in his sleep without making a sound, his throat opened by a blade that had been heated and cooled and sharpened until it could slice through flesh like paper. The second house held the bookkeeper Croft. the man who had destroyed Mercy. Thomas had promised this kill to Abina herself, and she had spent weeks deciding exactly how it would happen. She entered through the window that she knew Crawford kept unlatched to allow the night breeze. She found him snoring in his bed, stinking of rum and sweat, the ledger in which he kept his records of exploitation sitting on the nightstand beside him. She woke him with a hand over his mouth and let him see her face, let him understand who had come for him and why, before she used the knife that had once been Mama Sessa's to enact the payment that no court would ever have demanded. What she did to him took time. What she did to him was commensurate with what he had done to her sister and to the dozens of other women whose names were recorded in his ledger. When she finished, she burned the ledger and left his body as a message for anyone who might survive the night and wonder whether the old order still held power. The third house, the fourth, the fifth, fell in sequence. The drivers who had been selected for the night patrol joined the uprising openly, turning on the two overseers they had been assigned to assist and adding their bodies to the growing count. By 4, every overseer house had been taken. By 4:15, the weapon stores had been opened and muskets distributed to the fighters who had trained in secret for this moment. The great house remained, still glowing with candlelight, still echoing with the sounds of celebration that had grown ragged and disjointed as the drugs in the refreshments took full effect. McCreary was inside, along with 37 guests from neighboring plantations, their families, their personal servants who had accompanied them. The plan called for the great house to be surrounded, for the occupants to be given the choice of surrender or death, for justice to be administered according to the specific crimes of each individual. But plans rarely survive contact with reality, and reality intruded in the form of a coachman who had stepped outside to relieve himself and who saw the bodies being dragged from the overseer houses. His scream cut through the night like a machete through cane, and suddenly the element of surprise was gone. What followed was not the orderly execution of a carefully designed plan, but something more primal, more chaotic, more terrible. The guests inside the great house were too impaired to organize an effective defense, but some of the men had military experience and managed to barricade the doors while sending servants to the upper floors to shoot from the windows. The muskets seized from the overseer houses answered in kind, and for the first time in Jamaican history, enslaved Africans and their descendants engaged in a sustained firefight with their enslavers. The exchange lasted 40 minutes. 17 guests died from gunfire. 8 were killed when groups of the enslaved breached the barricades through the kitchen entrance and the side servant's door. The rest surrendered when it became clear that continuing to fight meant certain death. McCreary was among the survivors. He emerged from the front door with his hands raised, his fine clothes stained with blood and sweat and terror, his eyes searching the crowd of black faces for the source of this impossible catastrophe. Abina stepped forward from the mass of the liberated and let him see her. Let him understand that the healer he had overlooked, the tool he had used without acknowledging as human, had been the architect of his destruction. She did not speak. She did not need to. The look of horror that spread across his features as recognition dawned was more satisfying than any words could have been. She nodded to Thomas, who took McCreary and the other survivors to the punishment square, to the posts where so many of the enslaved had suffered, where the justice that the legal system would never provide would be administered by those it had most grievously wronged. The great house of Prosperity Estate burned for 4 hours, sending flames and smoke into the night sky that could be seen from 20 miles away. Across the northern parishes of Jamaica, that fire served as the signal that had been arranged. One by one, other estates rose in rebellion. Harmony Plantation fell within an hour of the signal fire being spotted, its entire white population killed or captured by the force that Caesar had trained. Golden Vale rose under Cuba's leadership, the Akan warriors moving with a discipline that recalled the military traditions of their homeland. Retreat, Blue Mountain, Flamstead, and the other coordinated estates followed in rapid succession. By dawn on December 22, 1791, a swath of Jamaica stretching 60 miles along the northern coast was in open revolt. Over 2,000 enslaved people had seized their freedom through violence. Over 150 white planters, overseers, and their families had been killed. The infrastructure of the sugar industry had been crippled by fires that consumed great houses, boiling houses, curing houses, and cane fields alike. The colonial government in Kingston, caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination of the uprising, faced the prospect of losing the most profitable colony in the British Empire. Abina directed the liberation of Prosperity Estate with the same methodical intelligence that had characterized the planning of the revolt. Those who wished to join the rebellion were armed and organized into fighting units. Those who were too young, too old, or too traumatized to fight were gathered together and prepared for evacuation to the caves in the cockpit country, where the Maroons had lived in freedom for generations. Food, weapons, medicine, and other supplies were salvaged from the estate before the fires consumed everything. The estate's records were burned, every document that had recorded the legal fiction of ownership over human beings reduced to ash that blew out across the Caribbean Sea. Only the slave registry was preserved, the book that recorded the names and origins of the enslaved, kept as a memorial to those who had suffered and died under the system that was now, at least on this small corner of the island, being torn apart. The white prisoners presented a more difficult question. Some among the liberated wanted immediate execution of everyone, complete and total vengeance for generations of suffering. Others argued for more selective justice, punishing the most brutal while sparing those who had shown mercy, or at least abstained from active cruelty. Abina listened to both arguments and made her decision. McCreary would die. His cruelties had earned him death 1,000 times over, and allowing him to live would send a message of weakness that could undermine the entire enterprise. Croft was already dead. His body left as testimony to the cost of violating the women of the enslaved. Dr. Porter would die for his experiments, for the limbs he had amputated without cause, for the lives he had ended with his treatments. The colored driver, Frederick, who had betrayed his own people for personal gain, would die as a warning to others who might consider collaboration. But the guests from neighboring plantations, those who had simply attended a Christmas ball at the wrong estate, would be held as hostages against the inevitable military response, their lives valuable only as bargaining chips in negotiations that might or might not ever occur. The executions took place in the punishment square as the sun rose on December 22nd. McCreary was the last to die, forced to watch as his subordinates faced the justice that he had taught so many of the enslaved to fear. What was done to him was done publicly, so that every former slave who wished to watch could see that even the most powerful of the overseers was, in the end, nothing but flesh and bone, nothing but a man who screamed and bled and begged just like anyone else. When it was over, his body was hung from the great cotton tree at the entrance to the estate, the same tree from which Cudjoe and the 7 other escapees had been displayed 6 months earlier. The symmetry was intentional. The message was clear. The British response came faster than Abina had anticipated, but in exactly the form she had predicted. Martial law was declared throughout the affected parishes within 24 hours. The garrison at Montego Bay, reinforced by the troops that had arrived just days before the uprising, began moving against the rebel-held estates on December 24th. The Jamaica Regiment, composed of regular soldiers with experience in colonial warfare, arrived from Kingston on December 27th. By the end of the year, over 3,000 British troops were engaged in suppressing the rebellion, the largest military operation in Jamaica since the Maroon Wars of the 1730s. The rebels were hopelessly outmatched in conventional military terms. They had muskets seized from plantation armories but limited ammunition. They had courage and desperation but little formal training. They had the advantage of numbers only when concentrated, and concentration made them vulnerable to the superior firepower and discipline of British regulars. The rebellion fragmented into smaller groups that retreated into the hills, conducting a guerrilla campaign that would continue for months but that could never hope to defeat the forces arrayed against it. The coordinated uprising that Abina had organized, that had for a few miraculous days seemed to promise the impossible, transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. Estate by estate, the British reclaimed the territory that had been seized on December 21st. The reprisals were savage beyond anything the enslaved had experienced before. Captured rebels were executed by the hundreds, their bodies hung along the roads leading to Montego Bay as warnings, their severed heads displayed on poles at crossroads and plantation entrances. Villages of free coloreds who were suspected of aiding the rebellion were burned to the ground, their inhabitants killed or sold back into slavery. The Maroon communities in the cockpit country, bound by treaties with the colonial government that required them to assist in suppressing slave uprisings, were mobilized to hunt the fugitive rebels through the limestone caves and dense forests where they had sought refuge. The death toll among the rebels and the enslaved populations of the affected estates would eventually exceed 2,200, not counting those who died of exposure, starvation, and disease in the months of pursuit and reprisal that followed the initial suppression. Prosperity Estate was retaken by a company of the Jamaica Regiment on January 3, 1792. They found the ruins of the great house still smoking, the overseer houses destroyed, the enslaved population scattered. 47 people who had not fled with the main body of rebels, mostly the elderly and the sick, were captured and questioned under torture about the leadership of the uprising. Several named Abena as the primary organizer, the woman they called Nanny of the Fire, who had coordinated not just the revolt at Prosperity, but the simultaneous risings across a dozen estates. The British launched an immediate manhunt. A reward of £500 was offered for her capture, the largest bounty ever placed on an enslaved person in Jamaican history. Informants throughout the island were promised freedom and cash for information leading to her arrest. The Maroon communities were specifically tasked with finding her, and some of their best trackers were assigned to the hunt. But Abena had planned for this as well. She had established multiple escape routes during the months of preparation, hidden caches of supplies in locations known only to her inner circle, and contingency meeting points where survivors could regroup if the rebellion was suppressed. The network that had allowed information to flow between plantations without detection now served as an underground railroad, moving her and her closest lieutenants from hiding place to hiding place, always one step ahead of the pursuers. The cave behind the waterfall where she had held her planning meetings became a temporary refuge, its entrance concealed by centuries of erosion and carefully maintained vegetation. From there, she directed what remained of the resistance, sending messages to rebel groups still fighting in the hills, coordinating the escape of survivors to Maroon territories, and planning for a future that she knew she might not live to see. The months that followed tested every resource Abena possessed. Betrayals came from unexpected quarters. Thomas, who had led the assault on the overseer houses, was captured in late January when he left the hills to find food for a group of survivors. He was tortured for 3 days before he died, without revealing the location of the main rebel hideout. Samuel the blacksmith was killed in a firefight with British troops when his group was ambushed near the Martha Brae River. Jupiter, the boatman who had carried messages along the coast, disappeared while attempting to arrange passage to Saint-Domingue, where an even larger slave revolution was transforming the French colony into what would eventually become the Free Nation of Haiti. Some suspected he had been captured at sea. Others believed he had reached Saint-Domingue and was fighting alongside Toussaint Louverture's forces. The truth was never established. Of the original 12 who had formed Abena's inner circle, only 3 remained by March 1792. Abena herself, Mary the prayer leader, and Patience the cook, who had escaped detection because her role in drugging the Christmas ball refreshments was never discovered. The 3 women moved through the forests and caves of the cockpit country like ghosts, surviving on wild yams and stream water, evading patrols that came within yards of their hiding places, maintaining a network of informants and sympathizers that kept them alive through the dry season and into the spring rains. The authorities never stopped hunting. The reward for Abena's capture was increased to £1,000 in April. A special unit of Maroon trackers and British Rangers was formed specifically to find her, led by a half-Maroon officer named John Reed, who was famous for his ability to follow a trail through the most impenetrable terrain. Reed came close several times. In May, he found the remnants of a campfire that was still warm, evidence that Abena and her companions had been in that location within hours. In June, he captured a woman who had been carrying messages between rebel groups and who, under torture, revealed the location of a supply cache that had been abandoned only days before his arrival. But the final capture always eluded him. The last piece of intelligence that would have led him to his quarry never materialized. The last confirmed sighting of Abena occurred on August 14, 1792, nearly 8 months after the uprising she had led. A British patrol reported encountering 3 black women on a mountain path in the eastern cockpit country, near the border with St. Elizabeth Parish. When ordered to halt, the women fled into the dense vegetation, moving with such speed and certainty that the patrol could not follow. The soldiers fired several shots but reported no hits. A search of the area the following day found traces of a small camp, some discarded food containers, and a single object that became the subject of speculation for decades afterward. A silver surgical knife, engraved with initials that match those of the woman known as Mama Sese, who had trained Abena in the healing arts and who had died 3 years before the uprising. Whether Abena dropped the knife during her flight, whether she left it intentionally as a message to her pursuers, or whether the soldiers fabricated the discovery to justify their failure to capture her remains unknown. What is known is that after August 14, 1792, Abena was never seen again by anyone who left a record of the sighting. The reward for her capture remained posted for 20 years. Stories circulated that she had escaped to Saint-Domingue and had joined the Haitian Revolution. Other stories claimed she had died in the hills and been buried by her last remaining companions in a location they carried to their own graves. Still other stories, whispered among the enslaved populations of Jamaica for generations afterward, suggested that she had never died at all, that she had become something more than human, that she walked the hills on moonless nights guiding other escapees to freedom, that her spirit had merged with the mountains themselves and would remain there until the last chain was broken and the last whip was burned and the last enslaved person on the island went free. If you watch this far, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched to the end," so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Hit that like button if the story of Abena touched your heart. Share this so that her memory is never forgotten. The colonial authorities tried to erase what had happened in December 1791. Official records minimized the scope of the uprising, attributed its coordination to outside agitators from Saint-Domingue rather than to the genius of an enslaved Jamaican woman, and emphasized the swift and complete suppression of the revolt rather than the months of guerrilla resistance that followed. The term Christmas Rebellion was applied to the events, making them seem like a localized disturbance tied to the holiday season rather than the coordinated revolutionary action they had actually been. The estates that had been destroyed were rebuilt. New enslaved populations were imported from Africa to replace those who had died in the fighting or been killed in the reprisals. Within 5 years, sugar production in Trelawney and St. James parishes had returned to pre-rebellion levels, and the planters were making speeches at colonial assemblies about the need for even stricter control measures to prevent future disturbances. But something had changed that could not be changed back. The enslaved populations of Jamaica had witnessed something that their owners had insisted was impossible. They had seen that the system could be challenged, that the overseers and planters who seemed so powerful in their everyday lives could be made to scream and beg and die like anyone else, that the great houses could burn, that the chains could be broken even if only temporarily. The memory of December 1791 passed from generation to generation through channels that the colonial authorities could not monitor or control. Whispered stories, coded songs, rituals performed in secret that commemorated those who had fought and died. The method that Abena had developed, the coordinated multi-estate uprising timed to exploit a moment of vulnerability, inspired similar attempts in the years that followed, not just in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean, wherever enslaved populations learned of what had happened. The colonial governments called it the Jamaican method in their confidential reports, analyzing it as a military threat, developing countermeasures, increasing surveillance, and living in fear that the next Christmas, the next hurricane, the next moment of distraction might trigger another explosion. The academic historians who eventually studied the 1791 uprising disagreed about almost everything regarding its significance. Some saw it as a minor disturbance that had been efficiently suppressed, evidence of the strength of the colonial system rather than its vulnerability. Others viewed it as a turning point, a moment when the internal contradictions of slavery became visible in ways that would eventually contribute to abolition. The debate over Abena herself was even more contentious. Some scholars questioned whether she had actually existed, arguing that the reports of a single mastermind behind the coordination of multiple estate uprisings were exaggerations or fabrications, that the rebellion had been the spontaneous product of shared grievances rather than the planned execution of a strategic vision. Others, drawing on the oral traditions that had preserved memories of the uprising long after the official records had been sealed, argued that Abena was not only real, but represented something that the colonial system most feared: evidence that the people it classified as property possessed intelligence, organizational capacity, and strategic vision that matched or exceeded that of their enslavers. The discovery of Dr. Porter's correspondence with colleagues in Edinburgh, which included references to the healer woman who moves between worlds without being seen, provided documentary evidence for Abina's existence, but left her fate as mysterious as ever. The Maroon communities of the cockpit country maintained their own traditions regarding her disappearance. Some elders spoke of a woman who had come to them in the final months of the hunt, wounded and exhausted, who had been hidden in the deepest caves until her wounds healed, and who had eventually traveled further into the interior, to places where even the Maroons rarely ventured, where the spirits of the African ancestors were said to still walk in their original forms. Others spoke of a burial site, never revealed to outsiders, where the body of the greatest rebel leader Jamaica had ever produced rested in a grave marked only by the sacred plants that grew from her bones. In 1833, the British Empire abolished slavery throughout its territories, a decision that historians attribute to many causes: the economic arguments that enslaved labor was less efficient than free labor, the moral campaigns of abolitionists in England, the political calculations of a changing parliament. But among those causes, rarely acknowledged in the official accounts, was the simple fact that the system had become too dangerous to maintain. The rebellions of 1791 in Jamaica, of 1791, 1804 in Saint-Domingue, of the early 1800s in Barbados, Grenada, and Demerara, had demonstrated that enslaved populations would fight for their freedom with a courage and determination that no amount of violence could permanently suppress. The cost of maintaining slavery, in terms of military force, social control, and economic disruption, had become greater than the profits it generated. The planters who had once spoken of their enslaved workers as docile and content were forced to acknowledge that they lived atop a volcano that could erupt at any moment. Abina and the other leaders of the 1791 uprising did not live to see abolition. They died in the hills, or disappeared into legend, or survived into old age in hiding, watching from a distance as the system they had attacked evolved, and eventually, too slowly, came to an end. But their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. They had planted seeds that grew in ways they could not have predicted, ideas about resistance and dignity, and the refusal to be property that passed from generation to generation, that crossed oceans and continents, that contributed to movements for freedom and justice that continue to this day. The fire she lit on December 21st, 1791, has never gone out. What happened to Mercy, Abina's younger sister, remains one of the most mysterious aspects of the aftermath. Some accounts suggest that she was among those evacuated to the Maroon territories in the first days after the uprising, that she lived for many years in the communities of free black people in the cockpit country, and that she eventually regained her ability to speak, though she never again sang the Akan songs of her childhood. Other accounts claim that she remained on the estate during the British reprisal, was recaptured, and was sold to a plantation in Cuba, where her ultimate fate was lost to history. Still other accounts, the ones that carry the weight of oral tradition if not documentary evidence, say that Mercy was with her sister until the very end, that she traveled with Abina through the months of flight and pursuit, that she was one of the 3 women spotted on the mountain path in August 1792, and that whatever happened to Abina happened to her as well. In one version of this story, Mercy was the one who finally buried her sister, performing the burial rites that Afua had taught them both, placing the body in a secret location that she alone knew, and then walking into the forest and never returning. In another version, neither sister died at all. They found a way across the sea to a place where no one knew their faces or their story, where they lived out their days as free women, speaking Akan to each other and to the children and grandchildren who came after them, keeping alive the language and the traditions that the Middle Passage had tried to destroy. There is no way to know which of these versions, if any, contains the truth. The records do not say. The official documents speak only of captured rebels and executed rebels and escaped rebels, without names or faces or stories, reducing human beings to categories in a ledger, just as the slave registries had reduced them to property valuations. But the oral traditions persist, passed from generation to generation, carrying memories that the official records tried to suppress, and in those traditions, Mercy eventually finds her voice again, eventually sings the songs of her ancestors, eventually transcends the trauma that a single act of violence had inflicted upon her. Whether this happened in historical fact or only in the collective imagination of those who needed to believe it could happen, matters less than the hope it represents. The hope that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the most profound violations can be survived, that the human spirit is capable of recovery even from the most devastating of blows. The Christmas Rebellion of 1791, as the colonial authorities called it, was officially over by April 1792, when the last organized group of rebels was dispersed by a combined force of British regulars and Maroon militia. The death toll on the rebel side was estimated at over 1,200, though this number was certainly an undercount, failing to include those who died of wounds, disease, and exposure in the weeks and months of flight and pursuit. The death toll on the colonial side was officially recorded as 297, including the guests at the Christmas ball, the overseers and drivers killed in the initial uprising, and the soldiers killed in the subsequent suppression. Damage to property was estimated at over £3 million, a staggering sum that represented years of accumulated profit consumed in days of revolutionary fire. 23 estates were totally destroyed, their great houses and processing facilities reduced to ruins that would take decades to fully rebuild. The sugar harvest of 1792 was a disaster, with production in Trelawney and St. James parishes falling to less than a quarter of normal levels. Insurance companies in London and Bristol faced claims that threatened their solvency. The share prices of companies with Jamaican investments collapsed on the London Stock Exchange. The economic impact of the rebellion extended far beyond the immediate destruction, sending tremors through the entire transatlantic economy that depended on the continued flow of sugar, rum, and the profits they generated. The political impact was equally significant. The Colonial Assembly in Kingston passed a series of new laws designed to prevent any recurrence. Restrictions on the movement of enslaved people between estates, prohibitions on gatherings of more than a few individuals, requirements for overseers to maintain weapons and ammunition sufficient to suppress uprisings, and penalties for any white person found teaching enslaved people to read or write. The militia was expanded and reformed, with regular training exercises and clear chains of command. The Maroon Treaties were renegotiated to include more specific obligations regarding the capture of escaped slaves and the suppression of rebellions. The colonial government constructed a series of fortified positions throughout the affected parishes, manned by regular troops who could respond quickly to any future disturbance. All of these measures were designed to ensure that what had happened in December 1791 would never happen again. But the very extent of these precautions revealed the depth of the fear that the rebellion had inspired. The planters who had once felt secure in their mastery over their human property now knew that security was an illusion, that they lived surrounded by people who hated them and who would kill them if given the opportunity, that the entire system of slavery was maintained not by consent or acceptance, but by violence alone, and that violence could be turned in the other direction at any moment. The women who had led the rebellion, a Bena chief among them but not alone, represented something that the colonial ideology of the time could not easily accommodate. The enslavers had constructed an elaborate justification for their system, arguing that Africans were inherently incapable of self-governance, that they were like children who required the firm hand of white supervision, that they were happier in bondage than they would have been in their native lands, that slavery was actually a form of civilization that elevated savages to a condition only marginally below that of their European betters. The events of December 1791 demolished every element of this self-serving mythology. The coordination of the uprising across 12 estates demonstrated strategic intelligence of the highest order. The discipline of the initial attacks demonstrated organizational capacity that the overseers themselves rarely achieved. The conduct of the rebel forces during the brief period of their success, with its selective violence directed at specific individuals for specific crimes rather than indiscriminate slaughter, demonstrated moral reasoning that compared favorably to the indiscriminate brutality of the colonial response. And the fact that a woman, enslaved from birth with no formal education, had conceived and executed a plan that brought the most profitable colony in the British Empire to its knees for months, forced those who thought about it honestly to confront possibilities about human capacity and human equality that their entire worldview depended on denying. Few thought about it honestly, of course. The colonial establishment responded to the challenge with increased repression rather than reflection. The arguments for racial inferiority were repeated with even greater vehemence. The enslaved populations were treated with even greater suspicion and cruelty. The lesson that the planters drew from December 1791 was not that their system was unjust, but that it was not brutal enough, that they had been too lenient, that they had allowed too many privileges that had been exploited by ungrateful rebels. This response was predictable, but ultimately self-defeating. Each increase in repression bred more resentment. Each act of cruelty sowed more seeds of future resistance. The cycle of violence and counter-violence that the rebellion had inaugurated would continue for decades, through the Second Maroon War of 1795, through the Barbadian Rebellion of 1816, through the Demerara Revolt of 1823, and finally through the massive Baptist War of 1831-32, which convinced the British Parliament that the system was no longer worth maintaining and led directly to the abolition of slavery throughout the empire in 1833. Abena did not live to see this final victory, but she had made it more possible through her actions and through the example she set. She had shown that resistance was possible. She had demonstrated that the enslaved possessed the capacity for complex planning and coordinated action. She had created a template that others would follow and improve upon. And she had become a symbol, a name whispered in the dark, a figure whose story carried meanings far beyond the specific events of December 1791. The fishermen off the coast of Trelawney Parish still speak of the drums that can be heard on certain nights, particularly on nights near the winter solstice, when the longest darkness of the year recalls the longest darkness of 1791. They say the drums carry messages, as they did in the days before the uprising, coded rhythms that meant one thing to those who understood and nothing to those who did not. They say that the spirits of those who died in the rebellion and its aftermath have never fully departed, that they remain in the hills and the caves and the ruins of the old estates, watching over their descendants and waiting for the completion of the work they began. They say that Abena herself walks on certain nights, visible only to those who have the sight to see her, a woman no longer young but still carrying herself with the dignity and purpose that made her the most hunted person in Jamaican history. They say that she appears to those who are about to make difficult decisions about justice and resistance, offering no words but only her presence, her example, her silent testimony that some things are worth dying for and that some forms of living are worse than death. Whether these are stories or something more, whether they are the fancies of people who need heroes in their past or the genuine traces of something that cannot be fully explained by rational means, the fishermen do not say. They tell the stories as they were told to them, passing them on to the next generation as their parents and grandparents passed them on to them, preserving a memory that no official archive contains and that no colonial suppression could ever fully erase. The ruins of Prosperity Estate remain as they have been for over 2 centuries now. The strangler figs have grown through what was once the great house, their roots intertwining with the crumbling stone walls until it is impossible to say where the building ends and the forest begins. The mahogany posts of the punishment square still stand, but the iron hooks have rusted to nothing, thin lines of orange stain on dark wood that only close examination would reveal. The great cotton tree is gone, victim of a hurricane that struck in 1889, but the spot where it stood is marked by a small clearing in the vegetation where nothing seems to grow, as if the earth itself remembers what hung from those branches and refuses to participate in forgetting. Occasionally, visitors find their way to the ruins, following old maps or fragmentary directions, or simply the call of something they cannot name. They walk among the remnants of a system that shaped the modern world, that generated the wealth on which empires were built, that consumed millions of African lives to sweeten the tea and the coffee of European aristocrats. They see the remains of the boiling house where enslaved workers labored in conditions that would be considered torture by any reasonable standard. They see the cemetery on the hill, where the dead were buried without markers or records, their names lost to history along with their stories. They see the provision grounds where the enslaved grew the food that kept them alive because their owners would not feed them adequately. And if they are sensitive to such things, if they allow themselves to feel what the place has to offer, They may sense something of what happened here, the suffering and the resistance, the death and the defiance, the fire and the blood, and the unbroken human spirit that refused to accept that the conditions of this place were the conditions that it deserved. Abina was born into slavery, lived her entire known life under the legal classification of property, and disappeared from the historical record in August of 1792, never to be conclusively heard from again. She had no formal education, no legal rights, no recognized humanity under the system that claimed to own her. She had every reason to accept her situation, to make the best of her circumstances, to survive by accommodation rather than resistance. And yet she did not. She looked at the system that surrounded her, the system that had killed her mother with overwork, that had sold her father into unknown bondage, that had destroyed her sister through sexual violence, that had murdered her friends and her community members for the crime of wanting to be free, and she decided that she would rather die fighting than live submitting. That decision cost her everything she had. It probably cost her her life. And yet it also gave her something that no slaveholder could have granted and no legal document could have conferred. Her humanity, reclaimed through action, asserted through rebellion, sealed in fire and blood on the longest night of 1791. We remember her today not because she won, in any conventional sense of the word winning. The rebellion was suppressed. The system continued for another 4 decades. The suffering that she had witnessed continued to be inflicted on millions of other enslaved people across the Americas and beyond. But we remember her because she showed what was possible, because she demonstrated that the seemingly permanent can be challenged, because she lit a fire that, in its own way, has never gone out. Her name was Abina, and she was called Nanny of the Fire, and she led the largest coordinated slave revolt in Jamaican history. And then she vanished into the hills and the mist and the stories that are still being told today. The details of her death may never be known. But the meaning of her life is clear enough for anyone who cares to read it in the ruins of Prosperity Estate, in the stories of the fishermen of Trelawney Parish, in the unbroken human spirit that continues to resist oppression wherever it is found.